19. Christian Apologetics. This was read to the Anglican Carmarthen Conference for Youth Leaders and Junior Clergy at Easter 1945. It was subsequently published in Undeceptions 1971 and later in Compelling Reason 1998. Some of you are priests and some are leaders of youth organizations. I have little right to address either. It is for priests to teach me, not for me to teach them. I have never helped to organize youth, and while I was young myself, I successfully avoided being organized. If I address you, it is in response to a request so urged that I came to regard compliance as a matter of obedience. I am to talk about apologetics. Apologetics means, of course, defense. The first question is, what do you propose to defend? Christianity, of course, and Christianity as understood by the Church in Wales. And here at the outset I must deal with an unpleasant business. It seems to the layman that in the Church of England we often hear from our priests doctrine which is not Anglican Christianity. It may depart from Anglican Christianity in either of two ways. One, it may be so broad or liberal or modern that it in fact excludes any real supernaturalism and thus ceases to be Christian at all. 2. It may, on the other hand, be Roman. It is not, of course, for me to define to you what Anglican Christianity is. I am your pupil, not your teacher. But I insist that wherever you draw the lines, bounding lines must exist, beyond which your doctrine will cease either to be Anglican or to be Christian. And I suggest also that the lines come a great deal sooner than many modern priests think. I think it is your duty to fix the lines clearly in your own minds, and if you wish to go beyond them, you must change your profession. This is your duty not specially as Christians or as priests, but as honest men. There is a danger here of the clergy developing a special professional conscience which obscures the very plain moral issue. Men who have passed beyond these boundary lines in either direction are apt to protest that they have come by their unorthodox opinions honestly. In defense of these opinions, they are prepared to suffer obloquy and to forfeit professional advancement. They thus come to feel like martyrs. But this simply misses the point which so gravely scandalizes the layman. We never doubted that the unorthodox opinions were honestly held. What we complain of is your continuing your ministry after you have come to hold them. We always knew that a man who makes his living as a paid agent of the Conservative Party may honestly change his views and honestly become a communist. What we deny is that he can honestly continue to be a Conservative agent and to receive money from one party while he supports the policy of another. Even when we have thus ruled out teaching which is in direct contradiction to our profession, we must define our task still further. We are to defend Christianity itself, the faith preached by the apostles, attested by the martyrs, embodied in the creeds, expounded by the fathers. This must be clearly distinguished from the whole of what any one of us may think about God and man. Each of us has his individual emphasis. Each holds, in addition to the faith, many opinions which seem to him to be consistent with it and true and important. And so perhaps they are. But as apologists, it is not our business to defend them. We are defending Christianity, not my religion. When we mention our personal opinions, we must always make quite clear the difference between them and the faith itself. St. Paul has given us the model in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. On a certain point he has no commandment of the Lord, but gives his judgment. No one is left in doubt as to the difference in status implied. This distinction, which is demanded by honesty, also gives the apologist a great tactical advantage. The great difficulty is to get modern audiences to realize that you are preaching Christianity solely and simply because you happen to think it true. They always suppose you are preaching it because you like it, or think it good for society, or something of that sort. Now, a clearly maintained distinction between what the faith actually says and what you would like it to have said, or what you understand, or what you personally find helpful or think probable, forces your audience to realize that you are tied to your data just as the scientist is tied by the results of the experiments, that you are not just saying what you like. This immediately helps them to realize that what is being discussed is a question about objective fact, not gas about ideals and points of view. Secondly, this scrupulous care to preserve the Christian message as something distinct from one's own ideas has one very good effect upon the apologist himself. It forces him, again and again, to face up to those elements in original Christianity which he personally finds obscure or repulsive. He is saved from the temptation to skip or slur or ignore what he finds disagreeable. And the man who yields to that temptation will, of course, never progress in Christian knowledge. For obviously, the doctrines which one finds easy are the doctrines which give Christian sanction to truths you already knew. The new truth, which you do not know and which you need, must, in the very nature of things, be hidden precisely in the doctrines you least like and least understand. It is just the same here as in science. The phenomenon which is troublesome, which doesn't fit in with the current scientific theories, is the phenomenon which compels reconsideration, and thus leads to new knowledge. Science progresses because scientists, instead of running away from such troublesome phenomena or hushing them up, are constantly seeking them out. In the same way, there will be progress in Christian knowledge only as long as we accept the challenge of the difficult or repellent doctrines. A liberal Christianity, which considers itself free to alter the faith whenever the faith looks perplexing or repellent, must be completely stagnant. Progress is made only into a resisting material. From this, there follows a corollary about the apologist's private reading. There are two questions he will naturally ask himself. 1. Have I been keeping abreast of recent movements in theology? 2. Have I stood firm, super monstratus vias, amidst all these winds of doctrine? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. I want to say emphatically that the second question is far the more important of the two. Our upbringing and the whole atmosphere of the world we live in make it certain that our main temptation will be that of yielding to winds of doctrine, not that of ignoring them. We are not at all likely to be hidebound. We are very likely indeed to be the slaves of fashion. If one has to choose between reading the new books and reading the old, one must choose the old. Not because they are necessarily better, but because they contain precisely those truths of which our own age is neglectful. The standard of permanent Christianity must be kept clear in our minds, and it is against that standard that we must test all contemporary thought. In fact, we must at all costs not move with the times. We serve one who said, "Heaven and earth shall move with the times, but my words shall not move with the times." Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, Mark chapter 13, verse 31, Luke chapter 21, verse 33. I am speaking so far of theological reading. Scientific reading is a different matter. If you know any science, it is very desirable that you should keep it up. We have to answer the current scientific attitude towards Christianity, not the attitude which scientists adopted 100 years ago. Science is in continual change, and we must try to keep abreast of it. For the same reason, we must be very cautious of snatching at any scientific theory which, for the moment, seems to be in our favour. We may mention such things, but we must mention them lightly and without claiming that they are more than interesting. Sentences beginning, "Science has now proved," should be avoided. If we try to base our apologetic on some recent development in science, we shall usually find that just as we have put the finishing touches to our argument, science has changed its mind and quietly withdrawn the theory we have been using as our foundation stone. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes is a sound principle. While we are on the subject of science, let me digress for a moment. I believe that any Christian who is qualified to write a good popular book on any science may do much more good by that than by any directly apologetic work. The difficulty we are up against is this. We can make people often attend to the Christian point of view for half an hour or so. But the moment they have gone away from our lecture or laid down our article, they are plunged back into a world where the opposite position is taken for granted. Every newspaper, film, novel, and textbook undermines our work. As long as that situation exists, widespread success is simply impossible. We must attack the enemy's line of communication. What we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects, with their Christianity latent. You can see this most easily if you look at it the other way round. Our faith is not very likely to be shaken by any book on Hinduism. But if, whenever we read an elementary book on geology, botany, politics, or astronomy, we found that its implications were Hindu, that would shake us. It is not the books written in direct defense of materialism that make the modern man a materialist. It is the materialistic assumptions in all the other books. In the same way, it is not books on Christianity that will really trouble him. But he would be troubled if, whenever he wanted a cheap, popular introduction to some science, the best work on the market was always by a Christian. The first step to the reconversion of the country is a series produced by Christians which can beat the Penguins and the Thinkers' Library on their own ground. Its Christianity would have to be latent, not explicit, and, of course, its science perfectly honest. Science twisted in the interests of apologetics would be sin and folly. But I must return to my immediate subject. Our business is to present that which is timeless, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8, in the particular language of our own age. The bad preacher does exactly the opposite. He takes the ideas of our own age and tricks them out in the traditional language of Christianity. Thus, for example, he may think about the Beveridge report and talk about the coming of the kingdom. The core of his thought is merely contemporary. Only the superficies is traditional. But your teaching must be timeless at its heart and wear a modern dress. This raises the question of theology and politics. The nearest I can get to a settlement of the frontier problem between them is this: that theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches us what means are effective. Thus theology tells us that every man ought to have a decent wage. Politics tells us by what means this is likely to be attained. Theology tells us which of these means are consistent with justice and charity. On the political question, guidance comes not from revelation, but from natural prudence, knowledge of complicated facts, and ripe experience. If we have these qualifications, we may, of course, state our political opinions. But then we must make it quite clear that we are giving our personal judgment and have no command from the Lord. Not many priests have these qualifications. Most political sermons teach the congregation nothing except what newspapers are taken at the rectory. Our great danger at present is lest the Church should continue to practice a merely missionary technique in what has become a missionary situation. A century ago, our task was to edify those who had been brought up in the faith. Our present task is chiefly to convert and instruct infidels. Great Britain is as much a part of the mission field as China. Now, if you were sent to the Bantus, you would be taught their language and traditions. You need similar teaching about the language and mental habits of your own uneducated and unbelieving fellow countrymen. Many priests are quite ignorant on this subject. What I know about it, I have learned from talking in RAF camps. They were mostly inhabited by Englishmen, and, therefore, some of what I shall say may be irrelevant to the situation in Wales. You will sift out what does not apply. 1. I find that the uneducated Englishman is an almost total skeptic about history. I had expected he would disbelieve the Gospels because they contain miracles, but he really disbelieves them because they deal with things that happened 2,000 years ago. He would disbelieve equally in the Battle of Actium if he heard of it. To those who have had our kind of education, his state of mind is very difficult to realize. To us, the present has always appeared as one section in a huge continuous process. In his mind, the present occupies almost the whole field of vision. Beyond it, isolated from it, and quite unimportant, is something called the old days, a small comic jungle in which highwaymen, Queen Elizabeth, knights in armour, etc. wander about. Then, strangest of all, beyond the old days comes a picture of primitive man. He is science, not history, and is therefore felt to be much more real than the old days. In other words, the prehistoric is much more believed in than the historic. 2. He has a distrust, very rational in the state of his knowledge, of ancient texts. Thus a man has sometimes said to me, "These records were written in the days before printing, weren't they? And you haven't got the original bit of paper, have you?" So what it comes to is that someone wrote something, and someone else copied it, and someone else copied that, and so on. Well, by the time it comes to us, it won't be in the least like the original. This is a difficult objection to deal with, because one cannot, there and then, start teaching the whole science of textual criticism. But at this point their real religion, i.e. faith in science, has come to my aid. The assurance that there is a science called textual criticism, and that its results, not only as regards the New Testament, but as regards ancient texts in general, are generally accepted, will usually be received without objection. I need hardly point out that the word text must not be used, since to your audience it means only a scriptural quotation. 3. A sense of sin is almost totally lacking. Our situation is thus very different from that of the apostles. The pagans, and still more the Metuentes, to whom they preached, were haunted by a sense of guilt, and to them the gospel was, therefore, good news. We address people who have been trained to believe that whatever goes wrong in the world is someone else's fault. The capitalists, the governments, the Nazis, the generals, etc. They approach God himself as his judges. They want to know not whether they can be acquitted for sin, but whether he can be acquitted for creating such a world. In attacking this fatal insensibility, it is useless to direct attention, A, to sins your audience do not commit, or B, to things they do but do not regard as sins. They are usually not drunkards. They are mostly fornicators, but then they do not feel fornication to be wrong. It is, therefore, useless to dwell on either of these subjects. Now that contraceptives have removed the obviously uncharitable element in fornication, I do not myself think we can expect people to recognize it as a sin until they have accepted Christianity as a whole. I cannot offer you a watertight technique for awaking the sense of sin. I can only say that, in my experience, if one begins from the sin that has been one's own chief problem during the last week, one is very often surprised at the way this shaft goes home. But whatever method we use, our continual effort must be to get their minds away from public affairs and crime and bring them down to brass tacks, to the whole network of spite, greed, envy, unfairness, and conceit in the lives of ordinary, decent people like themselves and ourselves. 4. We must learn the language of our audience. And let me say at the outset that it is no use at all laying down a priori what the plain man does or does not understand. You have to find out by experience. Thus, most of us would have supposed that the change from "may truly and indifferently minister justice" to "may truly and impartially" made that place easier to the uneducated. But a priest of my acquaintance discovered his sexton saw no difficulty in "indifferently." "It means making no difference between one man and another," he said, but had no idea what "impartially" meant. On this question of language, the best thing I can do is to make a list of words which are used by people in a sense different from ours. Atonement does not really exist in a spoken modern English, though it would be recognized as a religious word. Insofar as it conveys any meaning to the uneducated, I think it means compensation. No one word will express to them what Christians mean by atonement. You must paraphrase. Being, noun, never means merely entity in popular speech. Often it means what we should call a personal being. E.g., a man said to me, "I believe in the Holy Ghost, but I don't think he is a being." Catholic means papistical. Charity means A. alms, B. a charitable organization, C. much more rarely, indulgence, i.e., a charitable attitude towards a man is conceived as one that denies or condones his sins, not as one that loves the sinner in spite of them. Christian has come to include almost no idea of belief, usually a vague term of approval. The question, "What do you call a Christian?" has been asked of me again and again. The answer they wish to receive is, A Christian is a decent chap who's unselfish, etc. Church means A. Sacred building, B. The clergy. Does not suggest to them the company of all faithful people. Generally used in a bad sense. Direct defense of the church is part of our duty, but use of the word church, where there is no time to defend it, alienates sympathy and should be avoided where possible. Creative now means merely talented, original. The idea of creation in the theological sense is absent from their minds. Creature means beast, irrational animal. Such an expression as, "we are only creatures," would almost certainly be misunderstood. Crucifixion, cross, etc. Centuries of hymnody and religious cant have so exhausted these words that they now very faintly, if at all, convey the idea of execution by torture. It is better to paraphrase, and, for the same reason, to say flogged, for New Testament scourged. Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, Mark chapter 15, verse 15, John chapter 19, verse 1. Dogma, used by the people only in a bad sense to mean unproved assertion delivered in an arrogant manner. Immaculate conception, in the mouth of an uneducated speaker, always means virgin birth. Morality means chastity. Personal. I had argued for at least 10 minutes with a man about the existence of a personal devil, before I discovered that personal meant to him corporeal. I suspect this of being widespread. When they say they don't believe in a personal God, they may often mean only that they are not anthropomorphists. Potential, when used at all, is used in an engineering sense. Never means possible. Primitive means crude, clumsy, unfinished, inefficient. Primitive Christianity would not mean to them at all what it does to you. Sacrifice has no associations with temple and altar. They are familiar with this word only in the journalistic sense. The nation must be prepared for heavy sacrifices. Spiritual means primarily immaterial, incorporeal, but with serious confusions from the Christian uses of pneuma. Hence the idea that whatever is spiritual, in the sense of non-sensuous, is somehow better than anything sensuous. E.g., they don't really believe that envy could be as bad as drunkenness. Vulgarity usually means obscenity or smut. There are bad confusions, and not only in uneducated minds, between A. the obscene or lascivious, what is calculated to provoke lust, B. the indecorous, what offends against good taste or propriety, C. the vulgar proper, what is socially low. Good people tend to think B as sinful as A, with the result that others feel A to be just as innocent as B. To conclude, you must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour, but it is essential. It is also of the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. A passage from some theological work for translation into the vernacular ought to be a compulsory paper in every ordination examination. I turn now to the question of the actual attack. This may be either emotional or intellectual. If I speak only of the intellectual kind, that is not because I undervalue the other, because, not having been given the gifts necessary for carrying it out, I cannot give advice about it. But I wish to say most emphatically that where a speaker has that gift, the direct evangelical appeal of the come to Jesus type can be as overwhelming today as it was 100 years ago. I have seen it done, preluded by a religious film and accompanied by hymn singing, and with very remarkable effect. I cannot do it, but those who can ought to do it with all their might. I am not sure that the ideal missionary team ought not to consist of one who argues and one who, in the fullest sense of the word, preaches. Put up your arguer first to undermine their intellectual prejudices, then let the evangelist proper launch his appeal. I have seen this done with great success. But here I must concern myself only with the intellectual attack. non omnia possumus omnes. And first, a word of encouragement. Uneducated people are not irrational people. I have found that they will endure and can follow quite a lot of sustained argument if you go slowly. Often, indeed, the novelty of it, for they have seldom met it before, delights them. Do not attempt to water Christianity down. There must be no pretense that you can have it with the supernatural left out. So far as I can see, Christianity is precisely the one religion from which the miraculous cannot be separated. You must frankly argue for supernaturalism from the very outset. The two popular difficulties you will probably have to deal with are these. 1. Now that we know how huge the universe is and how insignificant the earth, it is ridiculous to believe that the universal God should be specially interested in our concerns. In answer to this, you must first correct their error about fact. The insignificance of Earth in relation to the universe is not a modern discovery. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy, Almagest, Book 1, Chapter 5, said that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, Earth must be treated as a mathematical point without magnitude. Secondly, you should point out that Christianity says what God has done for man. It doesn't say, because it doesn't know, what he has or has not done in other parts of the universe. Thirdly, you might recall the parable of the one lost sheep. Matthew chapter 18, verses 11 to 14, Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 7. If Earth has been specially sought by God, which we don't know, that may not imply that it is the most important thing in the universe, but only that it has strayed. Finally, challenge the whole tendency to identify size and importance. Is an elephant more important than a man, or a man's leg than his brain? 2. People believed in miracles in the old days because they didn't know then that they were contrary to the laws of nature. But they did. If St. Joseph didn't know that a virgin birth was contrary to nature, i.e., if he didn't yet know the normal origin of babies, why, on discovering his wife's pregnancy, was he minded to put her away? Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. Obviously, no event would be recorded as a wonder unless the recorders knew the natural order and saw that this was an exception. If people didn't know that the sun rose in the east, they wouldn't even be interested in its once rising in the west. They were not recorded as a miraculum, nor indeed recorded at all. The very idea of miracle presupposes knowledge of the laws of nature. You can't have the idea of an exception until you have the idea of a rule. It is very difficult to produce arguments on the popular level for the existence of God, and many of the most popular arguments seem to me invalid. Some of these may be produced in discussion by friendly members of the audience. This raises the whole problem of the embarrassing supporter. It is brutal and dangerous to repel him. It is often dishonest to agree with what he says. I usually try to avoid saying anything about the validity of his argument in itself, and reply, "Yes, that may do for you and me, but I'm afraid if we take that line, our friend here on my left might say," etc., etc. Fortunately, though very oddly, I have found that people are usually disposed to hear the divinity of our Lord discussed before going into the existence of God. When I began, I used, if I were giving 2 lectures, to devote the first to mere theism, but I soon gave up this method because it seemed to arouse little interest. The number of clear and determined atheists is apparently not very large. When we come to the incarnation itself, I usually find that some form of the aut deus aut malus homo can be used. The majority of them started with the idea of the great human teacher, who was deified by his superstitious followers. It must be pointed out how very improbable this is among Jews, and how different to anything that happened with Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad. The Lord's own words and claims, of which many are quite ignorant, must be forced home. The whole case, on a popular level, is very well put indeed in Chesterton's Everlasting Man. Something will usually have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. You who are trained theologians will be able to do this in ways which I could not. My own line was to say that I was a professional literary critic, and I thought I did know the difference between legend and historical writing. That the Gospels were certainly not legends. In one sense, they're not good enough. And that if they are not history, then they are realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. Little episodes such as Jesus writing in the dust, John chapter 8 verses 3 to 8, when they brought him the woman taken in adultery, which have no doctrinal significance at all, are the mark. One of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything whatever. You have to keep forcing them back, and again back, to the real point. Only thus will you be able to undermine a. Their belief that a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. B. Their firm belief of Article 18. Of course, it should be pointed out that, though all salvation is through Jesus, we need not conclude that he cannot save those who have not explicitly accepted him in this life. And it should, at least in my judgment, be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ whatever is true in all religions is consummated and perfected. But, on the other hand, I think we must attack, wherever we meet it, the nonsensical idea that mutually exclusive propositions about God can both be true. For my own part, I have sometimes told my audience that the only two things really worth considering are Christianity and Hinduism. Islam is only the greatest of the Christian heresies, Buddhism only the greatest of the Hindu heresies, real paganism is dead. All that was best in Judaism and Platonism survives in Christianity. There isn't really, for an adult mind, this infinite variety of religions to consider. We may, salva reverentia, divide religions as we do soups, into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. And now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly. And the only two religions that fulfill this condition are Hinduism and Christianity. But Hinduism fulfills it imperfectly. A clear religion of the Brahmin hermit in the jungle and the thick religion of the neighboring temple go on side by side. The Brahmin hermit doesn't bother about the temple prostitution, nor the worshipper in the temple about the hermit's metaphysic. But Christianity really breaks down the middle wall of the partition. It takes a convert from Central Africa and tells him to obey an enlightened universalist ethic. It takes a 20th century academic prig like me and tells me to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the Lord. The savage convert has to be clear, I have to be thick. That is how one knows one has come to the real religion. One last word. I have found that nothing is more dangerous to one's own faith than the work of an apologist. No doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on oneself. As a result, when you go away from that debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar. That is why we apologists take our lives in our hands and can be saved only by falling back continually from the web of our own arguments, as from our intellectual counters, into the reality, from Christian apologetics into Christ himself. That also is why we need one another's continual help. Oremus pro invicem. 40. Answers to questions on Christianity. first published as a pamphlet by the Electrical and Musical Industries Christian Fellowship, Hayes, Middlesex, 1944, and subsequently in Undeceptions, 1971, and Timeless at Heart, 1991. Lewis. I have been asked to open with a few words on Christianity and modern industry. Now, modern industry is a subject of which I know nothing at all. But for that very reason, it may illustrate what Christianity, in my opinion, does and does not do. Christianity does not replace the technical. When it tells you to feed the hungry, it doesn't give you lessons in cookery. If you want to learn that, you must go to a cook rather than a Christian. If you are not a professional economist and have no experience of industry, simply being a Christian won't give you the answer to industrial problems. My own idea is that modern industry is a radically hopeless system. You can improve wages, hours, conditions, etc., but all that doesn't cure the deepest trouble, i.e., that numbers of people are kept all their lives doing dull repetition work, which gives no full play to their faculties. How that is to be overcome I do not know. If a single country abandoned the system, it would merely fall a prey to the other countries which hadn't abandoned it. I don't know the solution. That is not the kind of thing Christianity teaches a person like me. Let's now carry on with the questions. Question 1. Christians are taught to love their neighbours. How, therefore, can they justify their attitude of supporting the war? Lewis. You are told to love your neighbour as yourself. How do you love yourself? When I look into my own mind, I find that I do not love myself by thinking myself a dear old chap, or having affectionate feelings. I do not think that I love myself because I am particularly good, but just because I am myself, and quite apart from my character. I might detest something which I have done. Nevertheless, I do not cease to love myself. In other words, that definite distinction that Christians make between hating sin and loving the sinner is one that you have been making in your own case since you were born. You dislike what you have done, but you don't cease to love yourself. You may even think that you ought to be hanged. You may even think that you ought to go to the police and own up and be hanged. Love is not an affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. It seems to me, therefore, that when the worst comes to the worst, if you cannot restrain a man by any method except by trying to kill him, then a Christian must do that. That is my answer, but I may be wrong. It is very difficult to answer, of course. Question 2. Supposing a factory worker asked you, "How can I find God?" How would you reply? Lewis. I don't see how the problem would be different for a factory worker than for anyone else. The primary thing about any man is that he is a human being, sharing all the ordinary human temptations and assets. What is the special problem about the factory worker? But perhaps it is worth saying this. Christianity really does two things about conditions here and now in this world. 1. It tries to make them as good as possible, i.e., to reform them. But also, 2. It fortifies you against them insofar as they remain bad. If what was in the questioner's mind was this problem of repetition work, then the factory worker's difficulty is the same as any other man confronted with any sorrow or difficulty. People will find God if they consciously seek from him the right attitude towards all unpleasant things, if that is the point of the question. Question 3. Will you please say how you would define a practicing Christian? Are there any other varieties? Lewis. Certainly there are a great many other varieties. It depends, of course, on what you mean by practicing Christian. If you mean one who has practiced Christianity in every respect at every moment of his life, then there is only one on record, Christ himself. In that sense, there are no practicing Christians, but only Christians who, in varying degrees, try to practice it and fail in varying degrees, and then start again. A perfect practice of Christianity would, of course, consist in a perfect imitation of the life of Christ. I mean, insofar as it was applicable in one's own particular circumstances. Not in an idiotic sense. It doesn't mean that every Christian should grow a beard, or be a bachelor, or become a travelling preacher. It means that every single act and feeling, every experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant, must be referred to God. It means looking at everything as something that comes from Him, and always looking to Him and asking His will first, and saying, "How would He wish me to deal with this?" A kind of picture or pattern, in a very remote way, of the relation between the perfect Christian and his God would be the relation of the good dog to its master. This is only a very imperfect picture, though, because the dog hasn't reason like its master, whereas we do share in God's reason, even if in an imperfect and uninterrupted way. Interrupted because we don't think rationally for very long at a time. It's too tiring, and we haven't information to understand things fully, and our intelligence itself has certain limitations. In that way, we are more like God than the dog is like us, though, of course, there are other ways in which the dog is more like us than we are like God. It is only an illustration. Question 4. What justification, on ethical grounds and on the grounds of social expediency, exists for the Church's attitude towards venereal disease and prophylaxis and publicity in connection with it? Lewis: I need further advice on that question, and then perhaps I can answer it. Can the questioner say which church he has in mind? Voice: The church concerned is the Church of England, and its attitude, though not written, is implicit in that it has more or less banned all publicity in connection with prophylactic methods of combating venereal disease. The view of some is that moral punishment should not be avoided. Lewis: I haven't myself met any clergyman of the Church of England who held that view, and I don't hold it myself. There are obvious objections to it. After all, it isn't only venereal disease that can be regarded as a punishment for bad conduct. Indigestion in old age may be the result of overeating in earlier life, but no one objects to advertisements for Beecham's pills. I, at any rate, strongly dissent from the view that you've mentioned. Question 5. Many people feel resentful or unhappy because they think they are the target of unjust fate. These feelings are stimulated by bereavement, illness, deranged domestic or working conditions, or the observation of suffering in others. What is the Christian view of this problem? Lewis: The Christian view is that men are created to be in a certain relationship to God. If we are in that relation to Him, the right relation to one another will follow inevitably. Christ said it was difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 19, verse 23, Mark chapter 10, verse 23, Luke chapter 18, verse 24. Referring, no doubt, to riches in the ordinary sense. But I think it really covers riches in every sense: good fortune, health, popularity, and all the things one wants to have. All these things tend, just as money tends, to make you feel independent of God, because if you have them, you are happy already and contented in this life. You don't want to turn away to anything more, and so you try to rest in a shadowy happiness, as if it could last forever. But God wants to give you a real and eternal happiness. Consequently, He may have to take all these riches away from you. If He doesn't, you will go on relying on them. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? But I am beginning to find out that what people call the cruel doctrines are really the kindest ones in the long run. I used to think it was a cruel doctrine to say that troubles and sorrows were punishments. But I find in practice that when you are in trouble, the moment you regard it as a punishment, it becomes easier to bear. If you think of this world as a place intended simply for our happiness, you find it quite intolerable. Think of it as a place of training and correction, and it's not so bad. Imagine a set of people all living in the same building. Half of them think it is a hotel, the other half think it is a prison. Those who think it a hotel might regard it as quite intolerable, and those who thought it was a prison might decide that it was really surprisingly comfortable. So that what seems the ugly doctrine is the one that comforts and strengthens you in the end. The people who try to hold an optimistic view of this world would become pessimists. The people who hold a pretty stern view of it become optimistic. Question 6. Materialists and some astronomers suggest that the solar planetary system and life as we know it was brought about by an accidental stellar collision. What is the Christian view of this theory? Lewis, if the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our present thoughts are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the thoughts of the materialists and astronomers as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts, i.e., of materialism and astronomy, are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give me a correct account of all the other accidents. It's like expecting that the accidental shape taken by the splash when you upset a milk jug should give you a correct account of how the jug was made and why it was upset. Question 7. Is it true that Christianity, especially the Protestant forms, tends to produce a gloomy, joyless condition of society which is like a pain in the neck to most people? Lewis, as to the distinction between Protestant and other forms of Christianity, it is very difficult to answer. I find by reading about the 16th century that people like Sir Thomas More, for whom I have a great respect, always regarded Martin Luther's doctrines not as gloomy thinking, but as wishful thinking. I doubt whether we can make a distinction between Protestant and other forms in this respect. Whether Protestantism is gloomy, and whether Christianity at all produces gloominess, I find it very difficult to answer, as I have never lived in a completely non-Christian society, nor a completely Christian one, and I wasn't there in the 16th century, and only have my knowledge from reading books. I think there is about the same amount of fun and gloom in all periods. The poems, novels, letters, etc. of every period all seem to show that. But again, I don't really know the answer, of course. I wasn't there. Question 8. Is it true that Christians must be prepared to live a life of personal discomfort and self-sacrifice in order to qualify for pie in the sky? Lewis, all people, whether Christians or not, must be prepared to live a life of discomfort. It is impossible to accept Christianity for the sake of finding comfort. But the Christian tries to lay himself open to the will of God, to do what God wants him to do. You don't know in advance whether God is going to set you to do something difficult or painful, or something that you will quite like. And some people of heroic mould are disappointed when the job doled out to them turns out to be something quite nice. But you must be prepared for the unpleasant things and the discomforts. I don't mean fasting and things like that. They are a different matter. When you are training soldiers in manoeuvres, you practice with blank ammunition, because you would like them to have practice before meeting the real enemy. So we must practice in abstaining from pleasures which are not in themselves wicked. If you don't abstain from pleasure, you won't be good when the time comes along. It is purely a matter of practice. Voice. Are not practices like fasting and self-denial borrowed from earlier or more primitive religions? Lewis. I can't say for certain which bits came into Christianity from earlier religions. An enormous amount did. I should find it hard to believe Christianity if that were not so. I couldn't believe that 999 religions were completely false and the remaining one true. In reality, Christianity is primarily the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, but also the fulfillment of what was vaguely hinted in all the religions at their best. What was vaguely seen in them all comes into focus in Christianity, just as God himself comes into focus by becoming a man. I take it that the speaker's remarks on earlier religions are based on evidence about modern savages. I don't think it is good evidence. Modern savages usually represent some decay in culture. You find them doing things which look as if they had a fairly civilized basis once, which they have forgotten. To assume that primitive man was exactly like the modern savage is unsound. A voice. Could you say any more on how one discovers whether a task is laid on one by God or whether it comes in some other way? If we cannot distinguish between the pleasant and the unpleasant things, it is a complicated matter. Lewis. We are guided by the ordinary rules of moral behavior, which I think are more or less common to the human race and quite reasonable and demanded by the circumstances. I don't mean anything like sitting down and waiting for a supernatural vision. A voice. We don't qualify for heaven by practice, but salvation is obtained at the cross. We do nothing to obtain it, but follow Christ. We may have pain or tribulation, but nothing we do qualifies us for heaven but Christ. Lewis. The controversy about faith and works is one that has gone on for a very long time, and it is a highly technical matter. I personally rely on the paradoxical text, "Work out your own salvation, for it is God that worketh in you." Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. It looks as if in one sense we do nothing, and in another case we do a damned lot. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, but you must have it in you before you can work it out. But I have no wish to go further into it, as it would interest no one but the Christians present, would it? Question 9. Would the application of Christian standards bring an end or greatly reduce scientific and material progress? In other words, is it wrong for a Christian to be ambitious and strive for personal success? Lewis. It is easier to think of a simplified example. How would the application of Christianity affect anyone on a desert island? Would he be less likely to build a comfortable hut? The answer is no. There might come a particular moment, of course, when Christianity would tell him to bother less about the hut, i.e., if he were in danger of coming to think that the hut was the most important thing in the universe. But there is no evidence that Christianity would prevent him from building it. Ambition. We must be careful what we mean by it. If it means the desire to get ahead of other people, which is what I think it does mean, then it is bad. If it means simply wanting to do a thing well, then it is good. It isn't wrong for an actor to want to act his part as well as it can possibly be acted, but the wish to have his name in bigger type than the other actors is a bad one. A voice. It's all right to be a general, but if it is one's ambition to be a general, then you shouldn't become one. Lewis. The mere event of becoming a general isn't either right or wrong in itself. What matters morally is your attitude towards it. The man may be thinking about winning a war. He may be wanting to be a general because he honestly thinks that he has a good plan and is glad of a chance to carry it out. That's all right. But if he is thinking, "What can I get out of the job?" or "How can I get on the front page of the Illustrated News?" then it is all wrong. And what we call ambition usually means the wish to be more conspicuous or more successful than someone else. It is this competitive element in it that is bad. It is perfectly reasonable to want to dance well or to look nice. But when the dominant wish is to dance better or look nicer than the others, when you begin to feel that if the others danced as well as you or looked as nice as you, that would take all the fun out of it, then you are going wrong. A voice. I am wondering how far we can ascribe to the work of the devil those very legitimate desires that we indulge in. Some people have a very sensitive conception of the presence of the devil. Others haven't. Is the devil as real as we think he is? That doesn't trouble some people, since they have no desire to be good, but others are continually harassed by the old man himself. Lewis. No reference to the devil or devils is included in any Christian creeds, and it is quite possible to be a Christian without believing in them. I do believe such beings exist, but that is my own affair. Supposing there to be such beings, the degree to which humans were conscious of their presence would presumably vary very much. I mean, the more a man was in the devil's power, the less he would be aware of it, on the principle that a man is still fairly sober as long as he knows he's drunk. It is the people who are fully awake and trying hard to be good who would be most aware of the devil. It is when you start arming against Hitler that you first realize your country is full of Nazi agents. Of course, they don't want you to know they are there. In the same way, the devil doesn't want you to believe in the devil. If devils exist, their first aim is to give you an anesthetic, to put you off your guard. Only if that fails do you become aware of them. A voice. Does Christianity retard scientific advancement? Or does it approve of those who help spiritually others who are on the road to perdition by scientifically removing the environmental causes of the trouble? Lewis. Yes, in the abstract it is certainly so. At a particular moment, if most human beings are concentrating only on material improvements in the environment, it may be the duty of Christians to point out, and pretty loudly, that this isn't the only thing that matters. but as a general rule it is in favour of all knowledge and all that will help the human race in any way. Question 10. The Bible was written thousands of years ago for people in a lower state of mental development than today. Many portions seem preposterous in the light of modern knowledge. In view of this, should not the Bible be rewritten with the object of discarding the fabulous and reinterpreting the remainder? Lewis. First of all, as to the people in a lower state of mental development, I am not so sure what lurks behind that. If it means that people 10,000 years ago did not know a good many things that we know now, of course I agree. But if it means that there has been any advance in intelligence in that time, I believe there is no evidence for any such thing. The Bible can be divided into two parts, the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament contains fabulous elements. The New Testament consists mostly of teaching, not of narrative at all. But where it is narrative, it is, in my opinion, historical. As to the fabulous element in the Old Testament, I very much doubt if you would be wise to chuck it out. What you get is something coming gradually into focus. First you get, scattered through the heathen religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and broken and then comes to life again. No one knows where he is supposed to have lived and died. He's not historical. Then you get the Old Testament. Religious ideas get a bit more focused. Everything is now connected with a particular nation. And it comes still more into focus as it goes on. Jonah and the whale, the book of Jonah. Noah and his ark, Genesis chapters 6 to 8, are fabulous. But the court history of King David, 2 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Kings chapter 2, is probably as reliable as the court history of Louis XIV. Then, in the New Testament, the thing really happens. The dying God really appears, as a historical person, living in a definite place and time. If we could sort out all the fabulous elements in the earlier stages and separate them from the historical ones, I think we might lose an essential part of the whole process. That is my own idea. Question 11. Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? Lewis. Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? While it lasts, the religion of worshipping oneself is the best. I have an elderly acquaintance of about 80 who has lived a life of unbroken selfishness and self-admiration from the earliest years, and is, more or less, I regret to say, one of the happiest men I know. From the moral point of view, it is very difficult. I am not approaching the question from that angle. As you perhaps know, I haven't always been a Christian. I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. I am certain there must be a patent American article on the market which will suit you far better, but I can't give any advice on it. Question 12. Are there any unmistakable outward signs in a person surrendered to God? Would he be cantankerous? Would he smoke? Lewis. I think of the advertisements for White Smiles toothpaste, saying that it is the best on the market. If they are true, it would follow that 1. Anyone who starts using it will have better teeth. 2. Anyone using it has better teeth than he would have if he weren't using it. But you can't test it in the case of one who has naturally bad teeth and uses it, and compare him with a healthy Negro who has never used toothpaste at all. Take the case of a sour old maid who is a Christian but cantankerous. On the other hand, take some pleasant and popular fellow but who has never been to church. Who knows how much more cantankerous the old maid might be if she were not a Christian, and how much more likable the nice fellow might be if he were a Christian. You can't judge Christianity simply by comparing the product in those two people. You would need to know what kind of raw material Christ was working on in both cases. As an illustration, let us take a case of industrialism. Let us take two factories. Factory A, with poor and inadequate plant, and Factory B, with first-class modern plant. You can't judge by the outside. You must consider the plant and the methods by which they are run, and considering the plant at Factory A, it may be a wonder it does anything at all. and considering the new machinery at Factory B, it may be a wonder it doesn't do better. Question 13. What is your opinion about raffles within the plant, no matter how good the cause, which, not infrequently, is given less prominence than the alluring list of prizes? Lewis. Gambling ought never to be an important part of a man's life. If it is a way in which large sums of money are transferred from person to person without doing any good, e.g. producing employment, goodwill, etc., then it is a bad thing. If it is carried out on a small scale, I am not sure that it is bad. I don't know much about it, because it is about the only vice to which I have no temptation at all, and I think it is a risk to talk about things which are not in my own make-up, because I don't understand them. If anyone comes to me asking me to play bridge for money, I just say, "How much do you hope to win? Take it and go away." Question 14. Many people are quite unable to understand the theological differences which have caused divisions in the Christian Church. Do you consider that these differences are fundamental, and is the time now ripe for reunion? Lewis. The time is always ripe for reunion. Divisions between Christians are a sin and a scandal, and Christians ought at all times to be making contributions towards reunion, if it is only by their prayers. I am only a layman and a recent Christian, and I do not know much about these things, but in all the things which I have written and thought, I have always stuck to traditional dogmatic positions. The result is that letters of agreement reach me from what are ordinarily regarded as the most different kinds of Christians. For instance, I get letters from Jesuits, monks, nuns, and also from Quakers and Welsh dissenters, and so on. So it seems to me that the extreme elements in every church are nearest one another, and the liberal and broad-minded people in each body could never be united at all. The world of dogmatic Christianity is a place in which thousands of people of quite different types keep on saying the same thing. And the world of broad-mindedness and watered-down religion is a world where a small number of people, all of the same type, say totally different things and change their minds every few minutes. We shall never get reunion from them. Question 15. In the past, the Church used various kinds of compulsion in attempts to force a particular brand of Christianity on the community. Given sufficient power, is there not a danger of this sort of thing happening again? Lewis. Yes. I hear nasty rumours coming from Spain. Persecution is a temptation to which all men are exposed. I had a postcard signed M.D., saying that anyone who expressed and published his belief in the virgin birth should be stripped and flogged. That shows you how easily persecution of Christians by the non-Christians might come back. Of course, they wouldn't call it persecution. They'd call it compulsory re-education of the ideologically unfit, or something like that. But of course, I have to admit that Christians themselves have been persecutors in the past. It was worse of them because they ought to have known better. They weren't worse in any other way. I detest every kind of religious compulsion. Only the other day I was writing an angry letter to the Spectator about church parades in the Home Guard. Question 16. Is attendance at a place of worship or membership with a Christian community necessary to a Christian way of life? Lewis. That's a question which I cannot answer. My own experience is that when I first became a Christian, about 14 years ago, I thought that I could do it on my own, by retiring to my rooms and reading theology, and I wouldn't go to the churches and gospel halls. And then later I found that it was the only way of flying your flag. And, of course, I found that this meant being a target. It is extraordinary how inconvenient to your family it becomes for you to get up early to go to church. It doesn't matter so much if you get up early for anything else, but if you get up early to go to church, it's very selfish of you, and you upset the house. If there is anything in the teaching of the New Testament which is in the nature of a command, it is that you are obliged to take the sacrament, and you can't do it without going to church. I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music. But as I went on, I saw the great merit of it. I came up against different people of quite different outlooks and different education, and then gradually my conceit just began peeling off. I realized that the hymns, which were just sixth-rate music, were nevertheless being sung with devotion and benefit by an old saint in elastic-sided boots in the opposite pew. And then you realize that you aren't fit to clean those boots. It gets you out of your solitary conceit. It is not for me to lay down laws, as I am only a layman, and I don't know much. Question 17. If it is true that one only has to want God enough in order to find him, how can I make myself want him enough to enable myself to find him? Lewis. If you don't want God, why are you so anxious to want him? I think that in reality the want is a real one, and I should say that this person has in fact found God, although it may not be fully recognized yet. We are not always aware of things at the time they happen. At any rate, what is more important is that God has found this person, and that is the main thing.